The phone buzzed twice against the marble counter while my husband was in the shower, and I almost let it go the way I always did. I never touched his phone. 14 years of marriage built on a kind of trust one was proud of, the kind I used to describe at dinner parties like it was an achievement. But something about the second buzz, sharper somehow than the first, made me glance down anyway. The message was still glowing on the lock screen when I looked. "Are you going to tell her about us?" I stood there in my own kitchen with a dish towel over my shoulder and felt the floor tilt half an inch beneath me. Not enough to fall. Just enough to notice. I didn't call up the stairs. I didn't drop the towel. I picked the phone up off the counter, and instead of setting it back down the way any reasonable, trusting wife would have, I unlocked it. His code was still our anniversary. It always had been. I used to think that meant something. I read the thread from the beginning, and then I did something that surprised even me. I typed back. Asterisk, not yet. Give me a little more time, asterisk. I hit send before I could talk myself out of it, and then I set the phone down exactly where I'd found it, screen dark again, and went back to wiping down a counter that was already clean. Upstairs, the water kept running. The house kept humming along the way it always did on a Tuesday evening, dishwasher cycling. The dog asleep by the back door. Absolutely nothing wrong with the world except for the fact that I had just found out my entire life was a forgery. My name is Vanessa Hale. I'm 41 years old, and for 19 years I have made my living looking at things other people believe are real and telling them, gently or not so gently, whether they are. I'm a fine art and antique appraiser. I authenticate estate jewelry, silver, porcelain, the occasional painting that someone's grandmother swore was worth a fortune. People bring me their inheritance, their family legends, their proof of who they are, and I tell them the truth about it, whether they want to hear it or not. I built a reputation on being the person who could not be fooled. I never once thought I'd need those instincts inside my own marriage. Adrian and I met when I was 26, appraising a set of Victorian mourning jewelry for an estate sale his development company was liquidating out of an old manor house outside the city. He was charming in the particular way that men who build things for a living tend to be, confident, easy in a room, the kind of man who could walk onto a construction site in a suit and somehow make it look natural. He watched me examine a brooch under a loupe for almost 10 minutes without saying a word, and when I finally looked up, he asked me what I'd found. I told him it was a fake, a good one, but a fake, and he laughed and said that was the most honest thing anyone had told him all year. 3 months later, we were together. For years after that, we were married. We built our lives around two things, his developments and my authentications. It made sense on paper. He'd acquire old estates, historic properties, the occasional manor house full of furniture and jewelry nobody in the family wanted to sort through, and I'd come in and appraise everything before it went to auction or got liquidated for the renovation budget. We were good at it together. For years, I thought that was the whole story. Two people who understood each other's work, who trusted each other with the most valuable things they owned. We have a daughter, Ren, 20 years old now, away at university studying architecture. Of all things, like some part of both of us had made its way into her without either of us trying. Somewhere in the last 3 years, though, the business had grown past what the two of us could manage alone, and I'd hired a junior appraiser to help carry the workload. Her name was Sloane Whitfield. She was 29, sharp, quick to learn, the kind of employee who made you feel like hiring her was the smartest decision you'd made all year. I trained her myself. I taught her how to read hallmarks, how to spot a replaced clasp, how to tell real patina from something acid-etched to look old. I brought her to job sites. I introduced her to Adrian's team, because that was simply how our life worked, our business woven so tightly into our marriage that there had never seemed to be a reason to separate the two. I want to be honest about something. Looking back, there were things I should have noticed sooner. The way Sloane started handling more of Adrian's site appraisals directly instead of running them through me first. The way her calendar always seemed to align with his site visits, even ones that had nothing to do with jewelry or provenance. The way Adrian had started championing her promotion months before I felt she was ready, pushing for it at dinner in that easy, confident voice of his, telling me I was being too cautious with someone so talented. I chalked it up to enthusiasm. I chalked up a lot of things to things that had nothing to do with the truth, because the alternative required a kind of suspicion I didn't want to carry into my own home. Standing in that kitchen with his phone glowing in my hand, I understood I had been carrying it anyway, whether I wanted to or not. I just hadn't let myself look at it directly until a stranger's message forced my eyes open. I heard the shower shut off upstairs, and I set the phone down in exactly the spot I'd found it, angle and all, the way I'd learned to place a piece of jewelry back in its box so no one could tell it had been examined. When Adrian came down 20 minutes later, hair still damp, asking what smelled so good, I told him I'd started dinner early. I smiled at him. I meant it to look easy, and it did because I've spent 19 years learning how to keep my face perfectly still while I'm looking at something that isn't what it claims to be. That night, after he fell asleep, I lay in the dark beside him and thought about the message glowing on his screen. Are you going to tell her about us? Not a question about whether something had happened. A question about timing. Someone out there believed it was only a matter of when, not if, and that meant this wasn't new. This was a plan that had been quietly moving forward for a while, and I had simply never been shown the file. There's a particular kind of grief that comes with realizing you weren't blindsided so much as you simply refused to look. I thought about all the small moments I'd let slide past me over the last year. The way Adrian's phone had started living face down on nightstands and countertops when it never used to. The way he'd begun taking calls out on the back porch with the door pulled almost all the way shut. The way he'd stopped asking me to walk him through new appraisals the way he used to, back when he still wanted my eyes on everything before it left the building. None of it had seemed like evidence at the time. It had simply seemed like a marriage settling into its comfortable middle years. Two busy people trusting each other enough not to need constant reassurance. I understand now that comfort and blindness can wear the exact same expression, and it takes something as blunt as a lit-up phone screen to tell you which one you've actually been living inside. I want to explain something about how I was trained to think, because it shaped everything I did next. When you spend your career authenticating things, you learn that the person trying to pass off a fake almost never gets caught by the obvious flaw. They get caught by the small inconsistency they never thought anyone would look closely enough to find. A hallmark stamped a decade too early. A solder joint that doesn't match the period. A story that sounds right until you check the one detail that doesn't fit. I had built a career on exactly that kind of patience, and lying awake that night, I understood I was about to need every bit of it. I didn't confront Adrian the next morning. I made coffee, packed his lunch out of old habit, kissed him at the door the way I always did. And once his car pulled out of the driveway, I sat down at my desk with a legal pad and started writing down everything I actually knew, which, when I looked at it plainly, was almost nothing. A text message. A feeling. A pattern of scheduling I'd never questioned because I trusted the people involved. So I started where I always start with anything I'm trying to authenticate. I gathered the provenance. I began with our shared business accounts, the ones that tracked commissions and consignment fees across every estate project we'd worked in the last 2 years. Most of it looked exactly like it should. But buried in the consignment records from 3 different estate liquidations, I found something that made my stomach drop in a completely different way than the text message had. Several high-value pieces, a diamond and platinum necklace from an estate in the hills, a set of Georgian silver candlesticks, an emerald ring I remembered appraising myself, had been listed as sold at auction for amounts that didn't match what I recalled valuing them at. Lower. Significantly lower. And the buyer listed for all 3, routed through a private consignment house I didn't recognize, was the same shell company, registered under a name I'd never heard of. I sat at my desk for a long time looking at that name, Meridian Provenance Group, LLC. It took me 2 days of quiet digging, evenings after Adrian went to bed, weekends he thought I was cataloging inventory at the studio, to trace Meridian Provenance Group back to its registered agent. The paperwork had been filed 18 months earlier. The registered address was a small office suite downtown I'd never had reason to visit. And the person listed as managing member, the name sitting right there on a public filing anyone could have looked up if they'd only thought to check, was Sloan Whitfield. I remember sitting perfectly still after I found it, the way you do when a piece of information rearranges everything around it without changing its shape at all. It wasn't just an affair. I understood that now with a kind of cold clarity that didn't feel like grief yet, though I suspected it would later. Someone had been quietly moving real, valuable, irreplaceable pieces out of client estates, replacing the numbers on paper with lower figures, and pocketing the difference through a company that had nothing to do with our business and everything to do with a woman my husband was texting about timing. I didn't say a word to Adrian. Instead, I called Delphine. Delphine Ochoa had worked the front desk at my studio for 6 years. She was the kind of employee who noticed everything and said almost nothing, careful in a way I'd always admired without fully understanding why. When I asked her to meet me for coffee on a Thursday morning, away from the studio, she hesitated on the phone in a way that told me she already knew this wasn't a casual conversation. She was quiet for a long moment after I sat down across from her, turning her cup in slow circles on the table before she finally looked up at me. "I should have told you a long time ago," she said. I kept telling myself it wasn't my place. "Tell me now," I said. She told me that over the past year, Sloan had asked her more than once to hold certain consignment paperwork until Vanessa was, in her words, out of the office, or too busy to review it closely. That Sloan had asked her to reissue authentication certificates on a handful of pieces, small revisions, she'd said, nothing that mattered. That Adrian had come by the studio several times when I wasn't there, always with Sloan, always leaving with a black portfolio case Delphine had assumed held paperwork. "I found one of the certificates in the printer once," Delphine said, her voice dropping. "It had your signature on it, Vanessa. Your actual signature. But I know you weren't in the building that day. I saw the calendar." I felt something in my chest go very still, the way it does right before you understand you're about to have to rebuild something from the ground up. My signature. My name, on paper, authenticating pieces I had never examined, attached to sales I'd never approved, funneling proceeds into a company I hadn't known existed until 3 days earlier. Whatever this was, it wasn't just betrayal in the ordinary sense. It was fraud wearing my professional reputation like a stolen coat. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, and I meant it gently, because I could see how much it had cost her just to say this much. "Because Adrian's your husband," she said. "And because I didn't have proof of anything, just a feeling that something was wrong, and feelings don't hold up against people who are that confident." "I'm sorry, Vanessa. I should have trusted my feelings sooner." I drove home that afternoon with both hands steady on the wheel and a mind that had gone somewhere very quiet and very organized, the way it does whenever I'm 3 hours into authenticating something complicated and the pattern finally starts to reveal itself. I understood now what the text message had actually meant. Sloan hadn't been asking whether Adrian would tell me about an affair. She'd been asking whether he would tell me before I found out on my own, because the timing of that conversation mattered enormously to whatever they were planning next, and my finding out first was apparently not part of the plan. That night, I did something I had never done in 14 years of marriage. I sat across the dinner table from my husband and asked him easy, ordinary questions about his day, and I listened to him lie to me with the same warm, unhurried voice he'd used the day he told me a Victorian brooch story that turned out to be entirely true. I watched him eat, watched him mention offhand that Sloan had really stepped up lately, that the Whitfield estate liquidation had gone smoother than expected thanks to her, and I nodded along, and somewhere underneath the table my hands were perfectly still in my lap, because I had already decided that this was not a fight I was going to lose by moving first. Over the following 2 weeks, I became someone I didn't entirely recognize, quieter, more careful, watching my own husband and his junior appraiser the way I would watch a piece under a loupe, looking for the flaw I already knew was there but needed to see clearly enough to prove. I photographed documents late at night after Adrian fell asleep, copying consignment files onto a personal drive he didn't know existed. I requested my own signature verification from 3 separate auction houses, quietly, under the pretense of a routine compliance review, and each one came back with a certificate I had never signed, a signature close enough to fool anyone who wasn't trained to look at the pressure and angle of a genuine one the way I was. I began keeping a small recorder in my bag, the way you'd keep anything else you hoped you'd never actually need, and more than once over those 2 weeks, I caught fragments of conversation that told me everything I needed to know and nothing I wanted to hear. Adrian on the phone in his home office, door not quite closed, telling someone that once the Ashford estate closed, there'd be enough in the account to finally move forward, that he just needed a little more time before he said anything to me, that I was, in his words, too sharp not to notice eventually, so they needed to be smart about it. too sharp not to notice eventually. I sat outside that door for a long moment after he said it, and felt something almost like a laugh rise up in my chest, bitter and quiet, because he was right. He simply hadn't understood that I already had. I found a lawyer the way I imagine most people in my position do, quickly, quietly, at midnight on my phone with the brightness turned all the way down. Her name was Renata Cole, a partner at a small firm that specialized in cases involving business fraud tangled up with divorce, which, as it turned out, was a more common combination than I would have guessed before all of this began. Her office was on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, and she reviewed my documentation for nearly 40 minutes without saying a word, occasionally making small marks in the margins of a legal pad with a pen that never seemed to stop moving. When she finally looked up, she studied me for a moment before she spoke. "I want to be direct with you," she said, "because I think that's what you'd prefer." "It is," I said. "This is not simply an affair, Mrs. Hale. What you've documented here is consignment fraud, forged authentication certificates bearing your professional signature, and the diversion of estate assets through a shell company controlled by your husband's associate. That is not just grounds for divorce. That is potentially criminal exposure for both of them, and it's exposure that could touch your professional license if it isn't handled correctly, given that your name is the one forged onto the paperwork." I felt my stomach tighten at that. "My license. Which is exactly why we're going to handle this carefully," she said. "You are not the one who committed fraud here. But right now, on paper, it looks like you did. We need to establish, clearly and early, that these signatures were forged, that you had no knowledge of the shell company, and that the diverted funds never passed through your control. Once that's established, the exposure shifts entirely to where it belongs. And Adrian? Depends how deep his involvement goes. Based on what you've shown me, deep enough that I'd be surprised if a criminal referral doesn't eventually follow the divorce filing. But that's not something you need to decide tonight. Tonight we file for protective measures around your professional certifications, and tomorrow we start building the record properly." I left her office with a folder of my own now, carbon copies of everything she intended to file that week, and I drove home rehearsing the version of myself I needed to keep performing, a wife slowly, unknowingly falling further behind while her husband and his associate believed they still had time to finish what they'd started. It worked better, and worse, than I expected. Adrian grew more relaxed with each passing day, more open at dinner about upcoming projects, more careless about where he left his phone, more willing to let Sloane's name slip into conversation with an ease that told me he had genuinely stopped believing I suspected anything. I watched him build his comfort the way you watch a structure go up on a site. He developed himself, one careless beam at a time, and I said nothing to disturb it because Renata had been right. The longer they believed they had time, the more they would hand me, without ever meaning to. 3 weeks after that first text message lit up his phone, Adrian mentioned over breakfast that Sloane had proposed hosting a small private preview event at the studio, an evening for select clients to view several newly authenticated estate pieces ahead of a major upcoming auction. It would be, he said, a wonderful showcase for the business, a chance to bring in the kind of high-value clients we'd always wanted. He suggested I let Sloane take the lead on organizing it, given how much she'd grown into the role. I told him that sounded like a lovely idea, and I meant every word of it, though not remotely for the reason he believed. Because if there was one place Sloane would have no choice but to present her forged certificates in front of an audience, under lights, with buyers ready to write checks, it was going to be that room. I spent the following 10 days building the file Renata and I would need, quietly cross-referencing every piece scheduled for the preview against my original appraisal records, confirming which certificates had been altered, which pieces had been secretly swapped for lower-grade replicas, while the originals were sold off through Meridian, and which buyers on the guest list had unknowingly already purchased items that weren't what they'd been told they were. By the time I finished, I had a folder Renata described, with the same flat professional calm she used for everything, as one of the more thorough evidentiary packages she'd seen assembled by a client who wasn't a forensic accountant herself. "You realize," she said, looking at me across her desk the day before the preview, "that once this happens, there's no quiet version of this story anymore." "I know," I said. "Are you sure that's what you want? We could handle this privately." File everything, let the divorce and the fraud claims move through the courts without ever staging a public moment. I thought about that for a long time before I answered her because it was a fair question, and because some part of me understood that what I was about to do would follow me for the rest of my career. The appraiser who exposed her own husband and protege in front of a room full of clients. But I thought about my signature on those forged certificates, my name attached to a lie I hadn't told, and I thought about every client walking into that room believing they were about to buy something real. I had spent 19 years protecting people from exactly that kind of deception. I wasn't going to let my own name be the instrument of it now. Quietly, behind closed doors, where no one would ever fully understand what had actually happened. I want the room to see the truth, I said. Not for revenge. Because I'm the one whose name is on the lie, and I'm the only one who can prove it isn't mine. The evening of the preview arrived clear and cold. The studio transformed with soft gold lighting and small clusters of clients moving between velvet-lined cases, champagne glasses in hand, admiring pieces I knew, one by one, to be either forged in origin or forged on paper. Sloane moved through the room in a deep green dress, radiant with the particular confidence of someone standing at the exact center of a plan she believed had already succeeded. Adrian stayed close to her most of the evening, more visible about it than I think even he realized, the two of them orbiting each other in a way that would have been obvious to anyone who'd been paying attention, which, until 3 weeks earlier, I had not been. I wore navy, simple, the pearls Adrian had given me on our 10th anniversary, and I carried a slim leather folder that I kept close against my side the entire evening, the way I'd learned to carry something I couldn't afford to have questioned before its time. Renata stood near the back of the room in a dark suit, unremarkable enough to blend into the crowd of clients, though I knew she was watching every case Sloane opened with the same quiet attention I was. Sloane took the small raised platform near the front of the room around 8, thanking everyone for coming, speaking with an easy polish about the studio's growth over the past 2 years, about the exceptional pieces she was honored to present that evening. She gestured toward the centerpiece case, a diamond and sapphire estate necklace I had personally appraised 18 months earlier at a value nearly triple what her printed certificate now claimed for a piece that, on closer inspection under the gallery lights, was not the same necklace at all. Before Sloane continues, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room as I stepped forward, I think everyone here deserves to know what they're actually looking at tonight. The room went quiet the way rooms do when something happens that wasn't on the program. Sloane's smile faltered for the first time all evening, and Adrian, standing near the bar with a glass of wine still in his hand, turned toward me with an expression I recognized instantly, the particular stillness of a man realizing the ground beneath him is no longer solid. I opened the folder and lifted the first page, my own original appraisal record for the sapphire necklace, now displayed in the case behind me. This piece was authenticated by me 18 months ago at a value of $140,000, I said. The certificate presented tonight lists it at $42,000, sold through a private consignment company called Meridian Provenance Group. I want to be very clear with everyone here. I did not authorize that sale. I did not sign that certificate. And the necklace in that case is not the same necklace I appraised. Gasps moved through the room in a soft ripple, the particular sound of a crowd realizing they're standing closer to a scandal than a sale. Sloane's face had gone pale beneath the gallery lights, her hand tightening around the small remote she'd been using to advance slides on a screen behind her. Vanessa, this is a misunderstanding, she said, her voice thinner than it had been 30 seconds earlier. There's a simple explanation. There is, I said. I have it here. I lifted the next page. A printed copy of the LLC registration for Meridian Provenance Group, her name circled in red exactly the way Renata had marked it for me the week before. This company is registered to you. It has received the proceeds from at least 7 pieces quietly diverted out of client estates over the last 18 months, each one replaced with a lower value substitute and sold under a forged version of my professional signature. I set the page down and lifted another. This is a signature verification report from 3 separate auction houses, confirming that the signatures on those certificates do not match my own. Adrian had moved closer now, his glass of wine abandoned somewhere behind him, his voice low and urgent when he finally spoke. Vanessa, let's not do this here. Whatever's going on, we can figure it out privately. I looked at him then, really looked the way I hadn't allowed myself to in 3 weeks of careful, patient silence. We had a chance to figure it out privately, I said. 3 weeks ago, when your phone buzzed while you were in the shower, and someone asked you whether you were finally going to tell me about the two of you. I answered that message myself, Adrian. Did you know that? I told her not yet.
Give it a little more time.
I wanted to see exactly how much time you both thought you had. The color drained from his face in a way I had never once seen in 14 years of marriage, not during difficult negotiations, not during the worst moments of his business, nothing that had ever shaken the easy confidence I'd fallen for at 26. Sloane's eyes moved between us, and I watched something behind them shift, the slow, sickening understanding of a woman realizing the man beside her had never once mentioned that his wife might already know. You've been together long enough to plan a shell company and forge certificates, I said, keeping my voice level, carrying clearly across a room that had gone completely still. I don't imagine either of you spent much time worrying about what would happen if I noticed. Renata stepped forward from the back of the room then, calm and unhurried in the particular way she'd promised me she would be, a folder of her own tucked beneath one arm. For those of you who purchased pieces through this studio over the past 18 months, she said, addressing the room with the same even, professional tone she used for everything, you'll be contacted individually this week regarding verification and, where necessary, restitution. I'd ask that no further transactions take place tonight. She turned towards Sloane. Ms. Whitfield, I'd strongly recommend you contact counsel of your own before this evening ends. Sloane didn't answer. She stood very still beside the case that held a necklace that wasn't what it claimed to be, and for the first time all evening, she looked exactly like what she was. A young woman who had built something clever and careless in equal measure, and who had just watched it come apart in front of the only audience that mattered. Adrian reached for my arm, his voice dropping low enough that only I could hear it. Please, Vanessa. Not like this. I stepped back before he could touch me. You had 14 years to be honest with me, I said. You chose 3 weeks of watching me find out on my own instead. I'm not the one who decided how this would happen, Adrian. You did, the moment you decided my name was something you could put on paper, without asking me. The rest of that evening moved the way I imagine these things always do once the truth is finally out loud in a room full of witnesses, slow at first, then all at once. Clients gathered their coats in quiet, uncertain clusters, murmuring to each other in the particular hush of people who have just watched something break that they didn't fully understand the shape of yet. A few approached me before they left, quiet words of concern, questions about their own purchases, and I answered each one calmly, because that steadiness, I realized, standing there in the wreckage of my own gallery opening, was the one thing I had left that no one had managed to forge. Sloane left first, slipping out a side entrance without another word to anyone, her green dress catching the gallery lights one last time before the door closed behind her. Adrian lingered near the platform for a long time afterward, staring at the case that held the necklace, at the folder still open on the table beside it, at the life he had apparently believed he could quietly restructure without ever once telling the person standing at the center of it. I need to understand something, he said finally, when the room had mostly emptied. How long have you known? I thought about the question for a moment, the same way Nicole must have felt asking herself something similar in a story I once half-listened to online, though I hadn't thought of it in years until that exact moment. Long enough, I almost said, but instead I told him the truth, because I owed myself that much honesty even if I didn't owe it to him anymore. Since the second your phone buzzed, I said. I just decided I wasn't going to let you know that until I understood exactly what I was looking at. He didn't have an answer for that. I don't think there was one. The weeks that followed moved quickly in the particular way that consequences do once they finally start arriving. Renata filed the divorce the following morning, along with a formal complaint establishing that the forged certificates had been created without my knowledge, protecting both my professional license and my standing with every accreditation board I'd spent 19 years building a relationship with. The signature verification reports did exactly what she'd promised they would, shifting the exposure decisively away from me and toward the two people who had actually created the fraud. Sloan was charged within the month, consignment fraud and forgery, the shell company unwound by investigators who found exactly the kind of trail I had, only with subpoena power behind it instead of a legal pad and a midnight internet search. Adrian's involvement took longer to fully surface, but it surfaced all the same. Financial records showing he'd known about Meridian from the beginning, that he'd introduced Sloan to two of the estate families whose pieces had been quietly diverted, that whatever he'd told himself about protecting me from difficult truths, he had in fact been helping build the entire structure of the lie from the inside. I didn't watch the criminal case unfold in detail. I let Renata handle what needed handling and focused instead on the parts of my life that were actually mine to rebuild. I closed the studio for 6 weeks while the professional review boards completed their inquiry, and I used that time the way I imagine most people in my position eventually learn to quietly, deliberately, putting distance between myself and a version of my life I no longer recognized as real. Ren came home from school the second week, and we sat together on the back porch one evening while I told her as much of the truth as felt fair to give a 20-year-old about her father, careful, measured, nothing more than she needed to carry. She listened without interrupting, the way she'd done since she was small, and when I finished, she reached over and squeezed my hand. "You didn't do anything wrong, Mom," she said. "You just noticed things other people didn't want you to notice. That's not a flaw. That's the whole reason people trust you." I thought about that for a long time after she went back to school. I had spent 19 years training myself to see the truth in things other people had already decided to believe, and somewhere along the way I had let myself believe my own marriage didn't need that same scrutiny, because trusting the people you love is supposed to be different from authenticating a piece of jewelry. I understand now that it isn't, not really. Trust, real trust, is exactly like provenance. It only means something if it can actually withstand being examined. Delphine stayed on through all of it, and I don't think I ever properly thanked her for what that cost her, coming forward against a man who signed part of her paycheck, against a co-worker she'd sat beside for 2 years. I gave her a raise she tried to refuse and a promotion she eventually accepted, and some mornings I catch her at the front desk checking a certificate twice before it goes out the door, the same careful habit I'd once tried to teach Sloan and had apparently only ever really taken root in someone else. I think we both understand now that the studio survived because of that habit, not despite it, and I've stopped apologizing for how long it takes us to verify things properly. Slow and honest, I tell new clients now, beats fast and forged every single time, and most of them nod like they already knew that, even though I suspect very few of them had ever really been tested on it before walking through my door. The studio reopened that spring under my name alone, and I rebuilt the client list slowly, transparently, walking every returning client through exactly what had happened and exactly how I'd corrected it. It cost me some business at first, the way scandal always does. But it earned me something I hadn't expected in return, a reputation not just for expertise but for the specific, hard-won kind of honesty that only comes from a person who has already had to prove herself once against the worst version of events. I started offering something new alongside the appraisals, a provenance verification service specifically designed to protect estate families from exactly the kind of quiet substitution fraud that had almost cost me everything, and within a year, it had become the busiest part of the business. I didn't hear from Adrian much after the divorce was finalized, a handful of necessary emails about Ren's tuition, nothing more. I heard secondhand, the way you always do, that he'd sold his stake in the development company to cover part of the restitution owed to the families Meridian had defrauded, and that he'd moved out of state not long after, trying, I assume, to build some quieter version of a life far away from the one that had come apart so completely under gallery lights in front of everyone who mattered to our business. I think about that message often, the one that started all of it. Are you going to tell her about us? I used to imagine in the weeks right after that Sloan had been asking a simple question about timing, about when Adrian intended to be honest with me. I understand now it was something closer to a countdown. Two people quietly measuring how much longer they had before the truth caught up with the life they'd been building underneath mine. What neither of them understood was that the truth doesn't actually need permission to arrive. It only needs someone patient enough to stop looking away from it. I sit in my studio most evenings now, long after the last client has gone, examining pieces under the same soft lamp I've used for 19 years, looking for the small inconsistency that tells the real story underneath whatever story someone else is hoping I'll believe. I don't do it with bitterness anymore. I do it, I think, with something closer to gratitude because that instinct, the one I almost let myself set aside inside my own home, turned out to be the exact thing that saved it in the end, even if what it saved looked nothing like what I thought I was protecting when I first picked up that phone. If you'd been standing in my kitchen that night, phone buzzing on the counter, I wonder what you would have done. Would you have set it back down and let the water keep running upstairs? Or would you have picked it up the way I did? I'd love to know what you think happens to Vanessa next, whether you think she lets someone new into her life, or whether you think she's already found everything she needs standing right there in that studio, on her own terms, under her own name. Leave a comment, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I love hearing from all of you. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you, so make sure you subscribe so you never miss a moment like this. Let's keep this journey going.